Tonight we've invited Steve Schwartz and Liz Putnam from the university to speak. And I'm just going to read a little bit from their bios that they sent me. First of all, I'd like to say that we wouldn't have known about this exhibit if it wasn't for Steve Schwartz, who brought it to the attention of Steve Gluckert, our curator. And at first we thought it was a little bit outside of our mission because it is so, these are beautiful photos, but it is so photojournalistic in nature and so investigative. And it has such a scientific and biological component to it. But it's different than what we usually present here. We tend to focus on artists from the Western states, Western region, contemporary art. So we were taking a risk in moving in this direction, but we knew that the asbestos crisis is not, the asbestos problem is right in our backyards. It's in our basements, in our attics, it's all over. And it's certainly in Libya. So it was an opportunity for us to reach out to the people in Libya and to explore what they're going through and to invite them into our community. So Steve is an assistant professor in the Department of Communication Studies. He teaches rhetorical theory, argumentation, persuasive speaking, and environmental rhetoric. So we don't want to get into an argument. He's going in. He's interested, this is really fascinating, in how language and symbols are used to influence public opinion about environmental issues. So Libya is just a hot spot. And since he arrived in Montana, he's been really interested in Libya and has written 2 scholarly papers about the subject. He is the recipient of a fellowship from the Center for the Rocky Mountain West and has recently received the Cox Education Excellence Award, and he's a great fellow to work with. First, Liz Putnam will present what she's been working on, and she's also been one of the key players in seeing this project through. She received her undergraduate degree in biochemistry. She might be the first biochemist to ever walk through the doors of the museum. Rutgers College. Good. And she received a PhD in biomedical sciences from the University of Texas. She's been at UM since 2000 and is an assistant professor of molecular genetics and toxicology at the Center for Environmental Health. You guys are both assistant professors. It makes it sound like you're helping somebody else. Actually, they're doing the full job. Let's see. Her research involves the influence of genetics on the development of environmental exposure-related diseases, with an emphasis on the exposure of Libby residents to asbestosis-contaminated vermiculite. So some of her research might actually help us in solving this crisis. So Liz will start.
Thanks, Renee. It's truly been a town and gown experience coming from an environment where I wasn't at an undergraduate campus. This has been a joy to understand how undergraduates can enhance what you do and how you can have a closer connection with the town. So what I'm going to try to do, since Steve and I named this Science and Rhetoric, I'm going to do the science half and Steve's going to do the rhetoric half. And what I want to do is actually steal a little of his thunder and tell you a story, because scientists can tell stories too, about what's been going on in Libby and what's been going on with some of the people and some of the diseases that they're facing, so that you can have a little bit more sense of the reality of what these folks go through on a daily basis. And then a little bit about my research, or at least the emphasis of my research, which is trying to determine the contributions of genetics and environment in development of this disease, because it's not all one or the other. And then Steve will take over and tell you more about words than I can do very well. So what I wanted to show you, for people who haven't quite placed it yet, and although we are pretty much Montanans, is that Libby is a tiny town in the northwestern corner of Montana, and it's an absolutely beautiful place. It sits in the middle of the Cabinet Mountains. It also has a very small population, so when we start talking about some of the numbers of folks who have been affected with asbestos-related diseases, you'll understand what a great impact it has on a town that only has 2,800 people living within its city limits. And to show you more, these are pictures by Mick Mills taken around Libby, Montana. Some of the other pictures of just the Cabinet Mountains and the waterfalls and the Kootenai Falls and how beautiful it is there. And now this is a lot of common sight there. This is a fellow from the EPA up on the mountain looking at an outcropping of asbestos-laden vermiculite. And here you can see them standing. Notice they're all in the clean suits with the rubber boots on, and again, asbestos-laden vermiculite. This is a picture in wintertime, so this isn't all dust on the ground, of the vermiculite mine. And the mine was open for almost 70 years. And at its height was spewing 5,000 pounds of asbestos or particulate matter into the air every single day. And this is carried on the winds, and because of the way the winds blow, it blew it right into town. Okay. And so the problem is not the vermiculite. Vermiculite is a great material. It has wonderful properties. The problem is that the asbestos is contaminating the vermiculite. And in particular, our Libby asbestos is a really complex mixture. And the problem is that the tremolite-actinolite series of asbestos is not one that's very commonly studied. So we're not quite sure what its properties are. We just know that when people are encountering this type of asbestos, which is very long, very thin, and very sharp, that it appears to be much more dangerous to human health than some of the other asbestos types that are commonly used in industry. And just to give you an idea of some size, here's some expanded vermiculite that you would see typically perhaps in potting soil or in some kind of soil additives to break up clay soil. So it can get to be very small, and of course you can imagine how it is ground up. Well, when this vermiculite is expanded and popped like that, it releases the asbestos into the air. So here is a common chunk. The vermiculite is the gold part. The white part is the asbestos. Okay? But this isn't just a problem for a small town in a small area, remote area of northwestern Montana. The problem goes way beyond Libby. Vermiculite was shipped to over 50 U.S. expansion plants. Those were the plants that W.R. Grace owned. It was shipped to over 250 plants worldwide. And as Renee mentioned, vermiculite is in our homes. It's anywhere between 15 and 35 million American homes have vermiculite insulation of some sort in their attics or in their walls, and guaranteed that vermiculite probably originated in Libby, Montana. So to show you, these are the processing plants and graded by the years that they operated. And you can see that they're spread out all over the country. There's rarely a state, maybe South Dakota or Wyoming, that didn't have an expansion plant there. And as for asbestosis mortality, these are data from the National Center for Health Statistics. And this is asbestosis mortality, people that died of asbestos-related diseases. And you can see up here, Lincoln County has had a huge mortality rate compared to some other places. But in some places you would imagine, like around the San Francisco Bay Area, around Seattle, the ports, Corpus Christi, Galveston, you can imagine that this is due to shipbuilding and the asbestos that was used in shipbuilding. But a good proportion of these, say in Cincinnati, were due to folks who are working with asbestos in, say, the Scott fertilizer plant. And they weren't working with asbestos. They didn't know, those folks didn't know they were working with asbestos. They were working with vermiculite. More of the tragedy. They didn't even know what they were working with. So, as I pointed out earlier, you can see that our little corner of northwestern Montana is a big player in the asbestos deaths in the country. So it's such an issue that ATSDR has designated phase 1 sites. These are 28 sites divided up by region, trying to put 1 or 2 in each region of the country, where they are going to investigate the same things that they investigated, the same type of health survey that they did in Libby. We have collaborators in Minneapolis, and we're contacting people in Trenton and other places to try to develop a way to access the people that they're identifying by way of the survey so that we can get further cohorts to enter into our studies. So the problem is that when you think of asbestos, most of the time the exposures happen because people work with it. They work in factories that make brakes, or they're mechanics that are working with brakes, or they're shipbuilders working with the boilers on the ships. The problem is that it's just not the occupational exposures that we have in Libby, and it's just not their household spouses, their children, the people that they carried the dust home to, but the fact that the vermiculite was used in your garden, in landscaping, that people were exposed through their recreational activities. You heard stories of how the ball fields were set up right next to the expansion plant, and they used the expansion plant material to line the ball fields. It's a nice, soft, cushiony area. The company was nice enough to donate the vermiculite to use as a base for the running track. So at the high school, people were the kids were running on the track, and with each step, puffs of dust were coming up, as far as the dust that contained both the vermiculite dust and asbestos dust in there. So what happened was we needed to find out, once the story was broken by Andrew Schneider, how many people were really affected. And Chris Weiss, Aubrey Miller, and Paul Perenard were sent to find out, is the story true or not? And if you were at the asbestos symposium, you know that the story was more than true. It was devastating. ATSDR came in and did medical testing for these people, and over 7,300 people have been tested. So if you look at the population of Lincoln County, and in the Libby area in particular, a huge proportion of those people felt that they had been exposed to the asbestos through contact with the vermiculite and went through the testing. Some of these people had moved away and had come back specifically for the testing. I have friends who worked in the Forest Service during the time that the mine was active that have gone back up for testing. The testing consisted of face-to-face interviews with a specific set of questions to obtain information, particularly about exposure route and potential symptoms that the people may have been experiencing. Those who were 18 years and older received chest x-rays, and then a breathing test to see if they could detect any kind of impairment in lung function. The results were that 18% had pleural abnormalities. Now, 18% may not seem high to you until you realize that only 0.2 to 2.3% of people with no known asbestos exposures have pleural abnormalities. 54% of people, or just 0.8%, had interstitial abnormalities. So that was out of the entire population. But if you looked at the miners, if the people who worked in the mine, whether directly with the ore or as contractors who trucked it from here to there, or even as people working as secretaries in the office on the mine site, the abnormalities were highest in workers at the mine. Well, it makes sense. They were around it all the time. You've heard what a dusty place it was. Okay? The scariest part of the entire survey results were that abnormalities were found in almost 7% of people who couldn't figure out how they could possibly have been exposed to the vermiculite and contaminated with the asbestos. This was, can you go back a minute? This was particularly scary because it means that all you had to do was live in Libby to receive some type of exposure, because those were the criteria. You had to have resided in Libby for 6 months prior to 1990. Okay. So as far as the testing results from the lung function tests, current smoking was the highest risk factor for having a lung abnormality or a lung function test abnormality, and that makes sense. There was moderate to severe restriction in almost 2% of the people, but it was more than doubled in former workers. So obviously there's some synergism going on. Yes, a lot of people in the community smoke. Yes, it's a rural area. Yes, these are blue-collar workers, but smoking doesn't explain all of their lung function abnormalities, and it doesn't explain the abnormalities in people that don't smoke. Okay. So just to show you a little bit of what we're talking about people breathing in tiny dust particles and tiny pieces of asbestos, and it coming down their trachea and breaking up and going into their lungs. So the interesting thing to think about is that the air passageways decrease in size but increase in number as you go down. So in the next slide, there's a picture of how you can imagine a tiny particle. These particles are so small that 1 million of them will fit within a centimeter, and you can see how they would get down to the very, very smallest reaches of the lungs. They would also come down to the very, very bottom of the lungs, and that's where the disease occurs. This is a disease of the lower and outer parts of the lungs, not the inner and major airways of the lungs, because the shards of asbestos pierce through this part of the lung and start causing the damage. So some of the asbestos-related diseases that we're talking about are, you'll hear these terms tossed around all the time, and maybe hopefully I'll be able to explain and give you some reference points of asbestosis and pleural plaques, mesothelioma, and then basically lung cancer. Okay? So asbestosis is fibrosis, and what's fibrosis? And you can see all the logical, the scientific form. Basically what it is that your lungs get clogged with extra protein that the body's making, trying to defend itself against what it sees as an invader. Okay? The bottom line is that you lose surface area for oxygen exchange. So these people are basically suffocating because they no longer have that interface between the air and the bloodstream. There's not as much space for oxygen to pass. The problem is that you can have an exposure to asbestos and not be sick or realize that you're sick for 15 or 20 years. Sometimes as long as 40 years later, people finally have enough of a problem that they go to the doctor and figure out that they've got an asbestos-related disease. Typically, if people do have fibrosis, they also have pleural plaques, which I'll explain in the next. Oh, and the next picture has some histology of what the asbestos in lungs look like. These are shards of asbestos that are now coated with protein that's being produced by the lungs. And eventually it comes to look like these, and these are what's called asbestos bodies. And normally lung architecture is very open, so there's a single cell layer, so you can see how oxygen can easily pass between the air that you're breathing in and your bloodstream to get oxygen throughout your body. Well, in asbestosis, these spaces are all clogged up with extra cells. The blue is a stain for collagen, which is one of the proteins that the body starts producing in response to the asbestos. So, and some x-rays, remember I told you that it's on the periphery of the lungs and the lower part of the lungs that get affected. So this is a relatively normal x-ray. This is from a patient, but this is from a patient who has mild disease. You can see some changes down here and here. This is from somebody with really advanced disease. And all this white that's here crisscrossing in the middle of the lungs is that extra protein that's been deposited in this person's lungs. Okay? What's different about what's going on in Libby is that a lot of the times people are seeing the first symptom or the first sign of any kind of asbestos disease is pleural plaques. And these are areas which are outside typically of the lung or on the lining of the outside of the lung. These are also seen long after initial exposure. The problem is that if you can imagine in Gone with the Wind, when Scarlett gets the corset tightened and tightened and tightened so that she can't breathe, but boy, her waist is nice and small. Well, it's essentially what a plaque does to your chest wall. Because what it does is we have nice elastic chest walls. They expand as we breathe in and they contract as we breathe out. But people who have pleural plaques can't do that because the tissue has grown on their chest walls so that it has no more expansion capabilities. So it's like they're being tied up in a corset and they can't expand their chest to take a deep breath. So can you imagine trying to walk to your mailbox without being able to take enough breath so that you have a chair sitting out at your mailbox so you can take a rest and once you pick up your mail and get your breath back so that you can make it back into your house. That's what a lot of our folks up in Libby have. So I would argue that pleural plaques are definitely an impairment to quality of life and to function, whether or not they have an overt ability as disease. Yes?
Does that effect combined with fibrosis physically lowering the rate of oxygen transfer to the blood?
Yes, it does. Yes, these both combine. The question was, or comment was, does the fibrosis add to this? And that's true. It does. So the bottom line is that if you try to check how much oxygen is in these folks' blood, you know, a person who's unaffected could have a 97, 98% oxygen saturation in their blood. And our Libby folks have much, much less than that. Okay? And then here's some pictures. This is a diaphragm with these yellow spots are the calcifications of pleural plaques on the diaphragm so that people can't lower, you know, your diaphragm lowers and tightens so that it can also let more air in. And in cross section, you can just see it's just fiber across that section.
You said calcification, is that hard?
Yeah, when you get calcification of something like this, it makes it much harder. So you have fiber, you have the extra protein that's already laid out, and then you put calcium on there, kind of cross-links everything, and it's really not going to move anywhere. So it's an added problem. Yeah?
As you're talking about how the pleural plaquing is not considered disease.
Well, I've heard arguments that it's not, yes.
Okay, I just wanted to underline that in some circumstances, for instance, if I understand it correctly, the current legislation is being considered in Washington, D.C. to address the problem at Libby and elsewhere does not address pleural plaquing. Is that right?
What I understand from the legislation, the way that it was tried, they attempted to bring it to the floor without Senator Baucus's amendment, would not have covered the disease seen in most Libby patients because their disease manifestation is mainly in pleural plaques, yes. Okay. Mesothelioma is one of the unfortunate consequences of asbestos exposure. It's also the one that caught the most attention when the mortality study was done by the EPA and ATSDR, because it's a relatively rare tumor of the pleura, and the pleura is the lining of your chest cavity. Development's not dose-related. All, as Pat Cohan, who's the clinical coordinator up in Libby, has told many a patient, all it takes is one fiber of asbestos to get some mesothelioma. Usually these folks have chest pain and breathlessness, And it's because their chests are filling up with fluid as a result of the tumor growing. And there's actual pictures here in Bill Ravanesi's exhibit of a young man, a 35-year-old man who died of mesothelioma. There's a picture of him in the hospital, and you can see the tumor actually protruding out, pushing out his chest wall. So that's how large they can get. Basically, after it's been diagnosed, survival is less than a year. Okay. And just to show you, there are some pictures that Bill has around the corner here of normal and diseased lungs. And this is just to show you, for example, this is the way the cross-section of a normal lung looks. And you can see how much of it is taken up with tumor in this section. Okay? And then when you look at it under a microscope, it looks like this, with a lot of globulated cells and just filled in. And remember that nice open picture of, actually, I'm sorry, this is on the outside of the lung. So normally you would have a nice thin layer or a couple layers thick of cells, and now instead of a couple layers of cells, you have a huge expanse of cells. This is just the tumor mass that's growing. So lung cancer is the most common fatal neoplasm in men, and it's also now the leading cancer death in women. So women are always afraid of breast cancer, where we should be more afraid of lung cancer. And most lung cancer deaths are directly attributed to smoking. But one of the things about asbestos exposure is that if you have 7 deaths per 100,000 from smoking and 10 deaths per 100,000 from asbestos exposure, you get 70 deaths per 100,000 with a combination of the two. The two are synergistic. They are more than just additive causes. It really increases the opportunity for you to develop a cancer when you have both smoking and asbestos exposure. And then on the next slide, here's a picture of, again, you can see that some parts of this looks more like normal lung, but quite quickly it starts becoming much thicker and disorganized and more cells growing than should be there. Okay? So what I'm interested in is looking at the gene-environment interactions, because obviously it's not just the environment. What happens to the two miners that worked side by side up there for 20 years, and one guy's carting around an oxygen tank and the other guy's doing fine? So if their environment is the same and their exposure is the same, then we're trying to take apart the genetics to look at that. And genetics and the environment can include diet, exercise, all the things you think of as lifestyle issues. Mark? So if you look at the genetic components of a risk for disease, you could have some gene variants that increase your risk for disease and maybe some that are protective. And when you put them all together, go ahead, overall, maybe your genetic component of the risk of your developing a disease may be on the side of having a decreased risk. Well, if you lay environment on top of that, and then this environmental factor may be that you worked up at the mine, and this environmental factor was, but you really watched your diet and you didn't smoke and you exercised and did all those things right, but overall, if you go ahead, and that would go ahead, overall you'll have an environmental component to the risk now that when you put together with the genetic component of the risk, suddenly now you've got overall perhaps an increase in the risk for developing disease. So the idea behind our research is to figure out what those variants are in the genes that are involved in disease development that are either protective or increase your susceptibility to developing disease. So just to show you, one of the things you know about is that we're in trying to figure out how people are different in each other. It's a huge effort that's being funded by NIH, and hopefully we can contribute a small part of that. But the question is that if you have this variation in response, and sometimes we have trouble having people understand that we're not born genetically equal. We've been fighting the civil rights battle for the last 40 years, but in reality we're not genetically equal. Of the 70 million Americans who smoke, so maybe a fifth of those will get lung cancer. And you look at the examples of Bogey, who died in his 40s, and then good old George. Okay. So the story isn't complete without telling you that there are real faces behind what's going on in living. And these are two of the faces that I've come to know very well, Leroy Tom and Gayla Benefield, who some of you hopefully had the chance to meet 2 weeks ago. And these are both people who are very involved in the effort to bring resources and education and health care into Libby to help folks with asbestos-related diseases. And then here are some other important people that are involved. You heard me mention Pat Cohan earlier as the clinic coordinator of the CARD clinic, and then Dr. Black and Dr. Whitehouse, who are the physicians who are mainly treating the people there. So now I'll turn this over to Steve, and we'll hear the rest of the story.
First of all, I'd like to thank the Art Museum for having this event tonight, and especially for bringing Bill's exhibit here. And so I'm going to try and motor through, and we can answer questions and all of that, but I hope that all of you will take the opportunity to look at Bill's exhibit, as well as Brian Plonka's exhibit upstairs, which has photographs specifically taken in Libby, and also the quilt that was put together by the Libby and Troy Quilt Guild is there as well. So if we can stay a little bit longer, that would be great. Thanks, Laura. I guess one place to start with what I do and the things that interest me about Libby comes from a few phrases that I've come across as I've read about Libby. So chew on these for a little bit. A failure to warn. Masters of manipulation. A company's silence countered safety fears. And I think my personal favorite, deception, denial, and document suppression. Right? All of these phrases are ones that I've come across in the process of examining the public discourse about the asbestos hazard. And I think what links all of them together, or at least what jumps out at me as a communication scholar, is that all of them point to the role that communication, whether useful or whether it's been squelched, the central role that communication has played in this particular public issue, both in prolonging this issue and keeping it under wraps for so long, but also the ways in which communication is used to draw attention to this problem. And so in general, that's what my research addresses, is how it is that communication practices have influenced public opinion and public action regarding asbestos. And rather than give you some sort of dry, theoretical talk about how all of these things work, what I want to do is just go through some of the wide variety of communication practices that I've noticed that I think are particularly interesting for us, especially as we as citizens try to identify how we are being influenced and persuaded, in particular by corporations that may not have our best interests in mind. So, so I'll approach this from two angles. And half an hour, all right, very well. I'll start by discussing some of the communication practices that hid the problems related to Libby asbestos. And then, with whatever time I have left, I'll talk about one particularly interesting way that people have used to draw attention to this problem. And I think it may have some resonance with Bill's exhibit. I'm still trying toying that out. So those will be the two angles that I'll work with. So as far as keeping the problems hidden, I think we might think of three very broad categories for conceptualizing how communication contributed to the long problem of asbestos exposure in Libby. The first and probably the most direct and obvious one is the suppression of evidence. Okay? Well, I think the clearest way and the clearest examples we have of how this problem was perpetuated for so long was that evidence of the problems of asbestos were suppressed by industry. And not just W.R. Grace, but the larger asbestos industry that's depicted in Bill's exhibit. One example of this are confidentiality agreements between government and industry. In nearly all of the documents that I have seen that corresponded between the Montana State Board of Health and W.R. Grace, they're stamped with confidential on them, right? And they're only for circulation among specific managers at the mine. And this kept the lid on all sorts of very basic facts about what was going on at the mine. In 1956, for example, the State Board of Health reported that asbestos dust was toxic. Right? In 1959, as early as 1959 and on through the 60s and 70s, there are a series of State Board of Health inspection reports that showed that the mine often exceeded the permissible exposure levels, or the maximum allowable concentration levels. In addition, W.R. Grace authorized several scientific studies that were also subject to confidentiality agreements. So, for example, in 1976, there was a memo that circulated and in fact went to the desk of J. Peter Grace, Jr., the head of the company. And this outlined a study that was going to study the effects of tremolite on hamsters. Okay? And the quote from this one, it just says it quite clearly. All results of our tremolite study will be reported solely to W.R. Grace and Company, and any publication of the finding will be made only by mutual agreement. Okay? And this is the case across the asbestos industry as well. Throughout the 40s and 50s, there are considerable studies that were done that came out in discovery and legal proceedings that showed that companies had knowledge of asbestos hazards, but many of those studies were simply suppressed. Another way in which evidence was suppressed is with regard to medical evidence that was not shared with workers. Reports again in 1959 showed that 37% of the workers at the mine at that time had abnormal chest x-rays. Even going as late as 1977, a mortality study of former Libby employees showed that there was asbestosis in 41% of their workers with over 10 years of service. And 28% of workers with more than 10 years of service at the expanding plants that were shown on the map that Liz showed earlier. It's been sort of unclear as to how well or whether the results of these studies were actually passed on to workers and citizens in Libby. Mike Krill, who's here from Libby, may be able to address some of that for us. But most of the things that I have read suggest that this kind of information simply was not getting back effectively and thoroughly to most of the workers. In addition, it was filtered through doctors who were part of the town's elite and were often reticent to blow the whistle on the company. One thing that Gayla Benefield noted to me is that for as long as she could remember, someone from W.R. Grace had always been on the board of the hospital up in Libby. And so we can start to think about the kinds of pressure that might be put on people to not really fully address this issue. So my point here is simply that evidence about working conditions and occupational health did not really see the light of day or see the light of public scrutiny, and nor did they generate sufficient regulatory action to stop exposure. So first of all, the most obvious way in which communication affected the prolonged problem in Libby was the suppression of evidence. A second way in which communication hid some of these problems is through the symbolic distortion of reality. Okay? Now, by that I mean that there was some evidence and discussion that was not suppressed. It wasn't the case that the mine or the state was necessarily totally silent about these issues, but rather the way that they talked about them made it much more difficult to really see and understand the problems that existed. So there are symbolic choices that were made that acknowledge reality but shape how we think about it. One of the most pervasive examples that I hear of is the phrase nuisance dust. Okay? This is a term that, as far as I can tell, comes from a 1944 State Board of Health report that found that there was relatively low levels of silica in the dust. Okay? This was one of the silica, right, contributes to silicosis. This is one of the main occupational hazards of the time. There was no mention of asbestos in this particular report. And so basically there was a low level of silica, no attention to asbestos. So the dust that was coming out of the mine that was being produced during the milling process was seen as a nuisance dust by state officials. Okay? Obviously, this didn't quite capture what that dust was really all about. In 1956, for example, the state again acknowledged that there was asbestos dust present at the mine, and it was reported to be of considerable toxicity. By 1961, managers were saying that there was, quote, a relatively large amount of asbestos dust present in our mill, and this is difficult to control. So even as early as the late 50s and early 60s, there was acknowledgement, there was awareness that there was an asbestos dust problem. But still, throughout many of the interviews and the reports from Andrew Schneider and others, former miners consistently report that managers characterized the dust as a nuisance dust, that it was not harmful and that it could be coughed out. Okay? So this is one sort of phrase that creeps up time and time again to characterize what the reality of that dust was all about, and in a way that's rather misleading. The second way in which reality was distorted was through what I call the smoking gun, and with the emphasis on the word smoking. Okay? And Liz has addressed some of these issues already. Company documents show that lung disease of all kinds was often portrayed as the result of smoking. In other words, the cause-effect relationship that was being explained by company officials, both to the public and to the government and to the miners, was that lung problems were the result of smoking, not tremolite. Particularly interesting evidence of this was that shortly after the establishment of a new mill, a wet processing mill that was intended to keep the dust down and to minimize the dust problem, the company also implemented an extensive no-smoking program for all of its workers. In producing this kind of text and explanation and program for the workers, workers were assured that the company had come a long way in reducing the dust, that current exposures with this new technology, current exposures were not hazardous to workers' health, and again, that smoking was the chief cause of lung problems. Now what this does, right, is it deflects attention from the problem of this tremolite asbestos in the dust. The dust was being described as something that was being dealt with and being dealt with effectively by the management, whereas smoking was something that employees could control. So attention was being focused on smoking and away from the tremolite issue. A third way in which language was creatively used to shape perception about problems of asbestos was with the label of asbestos-free products that were being produced by W.R. Grace. One of W.R. Grace's largest products was a fireproofing product called Monocoat, and it was advertised as being asbestos-free. There's examples of advertisements that show that this was one of the key ways in which Grace was trying to promote their particular product, right? Other people have asbestos in their products, but we don't, okay? The company supported this contention to federal regulators by explaining that, first of all, no asbestos was added to their products, as if that supposedly made it asbestos-free. Further, they said that any amount of naturally occurring asbestos was, as they put it, and this is a direct quote, trifling and insignificant. The reason they felt they were able to do that was because it was the amounts of asbestos that they could measure were below the 1% standard that had been established by the Environmental Protection Agency. So in other words, if they could produce reports that showed there's less than 1% asbestos in this product, then the amount is trifling, insignificant, and not even insignificant, asbestos-free. Okay? So this asbestos-free label then was misleading, right? For in fact, there was tremolite asbestos in the product, and as Grace was finding out from some of the previously mentioned studies, even very small amounts, trace amounts below the 1% standard could harm human health. So the label encouraged the perception that users would face no risk of asbestos exposure from the product and thus have no threat to their health, when that was clearly not the case. This labeling, or this misleading labeling, leads to a third broad way in which problems with asbestos were kept hidden. And this I would call, and again, sort of using the metaphor of the constriction of lungs, there was a constriction of public communication that was the constriction of the public communication process around this issue within Libby. First of all, again, if we look at product labeling, there was a memo that went along with this product labeling that sort of explained their perception of what W.R. Grace thought this label would do for discussion of asbestos. They said, we recommend that W.R. Grace continue with the label wording that, quote, states compliance with EPA regulation. This statement has the advantage of reducing specific questions from customers about the asbestos content, thereby reducing the number of times we have to be concerned about responding to such questions. So here, right, the product labeling, right, served to limit public discussion and limit citizens' inquiry in order to simply improve the company's efficiency, right? So we don't have to answer all those questions all the time. There's a second example of the constriction of public communication that is documented in what Gala Benefield calls the A through G memo. Okay? What the A through G memo does, okay, is it outlines a series of ways in which W.R. Grace is going to try to shut down a NIOSH study of health problems in the Libby mine. And I just want to read from Schneider's book where he lists this, the A through G memo. This is a memo that was produced by R.H. Locke, who was with the Grace Constructions Product Division, and it was written on November 26th, 1980. So it was just after the 1980 election of Ronald Reagan. What the A through G memo does, okay, is it lists a series of bullet points, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, as to how they're going to turn off or how they're going to minimize this study and sort of prevent discussion of it. Their first letter, okay. It is assumed that NIOSH will submit a Libby study protocol. This might not be bad policy generally, and it is possible that the new administration's policies will make NIOSH more selective in how scarce staff resources are allocated after January 20th, 1981. And in fact, Schneider and others have gone on to show that in fact, right, studies that were undertaken in the early 1980s were shelved as a direct result of Peter Grace's influence on government regulation. Right. The attempt to sort of minimize regulation and downsize government led to the shelving of studies that were already underway about the health problems in Libby. I'll skip over a couple of other ones and go to what I think are the more interesting ones to read. E, actively go upstream in NIOSH to personally repeat the same arguments, the first time immediately after receipt of the protocol. So here, right, again, is to try to squash it in as many different spots as possible. F, actively seek to turn off the sources of the pressure for the study by personally repeating this required. So this is an amazing document, right, that shows sort of the inner workings as to how communication and how circulation of evidence and ideas is intentionally and explicitly foreclosed by the company. A third one, which has just sort of popped up to me in recent discussions that I've had with Gala Benefield, and this has to do with in Libby. Okay? The kicker was that W.R. Grace had convinced victims and their lawyers that they could not discuss their settlements with anyone. Lawyers then refused to discuss it because, in their view, W.R. Grace had them convinced that if anyone discusses this problem, no more money would come from W.R. Grace to victims. Okay? So there was an incentive for lawyers to not discuss the problem and to keep a lid on it. Victims, too, felt that the terms of their settlement dictated utter silence, that they would lose the money if they and gain public awareness and gain public support to address these issues. And I'll just that can make establishing common ground very difficult. Right? It can make it hard for a community to come together. We hear, especially in environmental issues, we hear we need to have more collaboration. We need to all come together and sit down at the table. But in the situation of Libby, that is precisely what had happened for so long. There was such a close identification between the mine and the community that there was very little social division. There was not enough critical distance that people could come out and say that W.R. Grace was doing something wrong or the government is failing us in this regard. So one of the things that this stark division did, right, in imposing W.R. Grace as the bad guys and miners and their families as innocent victims, right, is it started to encourage people to see their community differently, right? It started to break those tight bonds of identification between the community and the mine in ways that allowed this problem to come to light. And in addition, right, what melodrama does is it foregrounds emotion. Okay? The use of emotion, in my view, is not necessarily always a bad thing in public discourse, right? Because by developing emotion, right, by encouraging people to feel the things that people in Libby are feeling, we can gain social support and public political support for the kinds of actions and policies that are needed to help solve their contamination problems and their health problems. And I think that that is one of the things that Bill's exhibit does as well, right? It helps to reframe and encourage us to rethink our sense of identification. Do we automatically identify with businesses and corporations? Or do we identify with other fellow citizens who are going through difficult challenges and plights? One of the things I think that melodrama does, and that I think the Bill's exhibit does, is it encourages us to look straight in the eye of people who are affected by asbestos disease and generate the kind of social support that is needed to address their problems. Thanks.